Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Nesbitt-Nisbet Society talk. So, as advertised, I'm going to take you on a little journey around Nesbitt and Nisbet sites in Scotland. And I was just reflecting, actually, as I put this together, why Scotland, why not England, why not Ireland? I mean, Ireland has some really fascinating Nisbet houses, none of which I've ever visited, so nothing much to say there. And in England, there are properties. We will all know about properties in our own lineage, but rarely occupied for more than a generation, I think, for many of us, unless we perhaps come from a farming family. So there is, in fact, something about Scotland to do with nature of land tenure and so on that does mean that there are large number of multi-generation properties and land occupied by Nesbits and Nisbets. And so that's really why I have visited pretty high proportion of those places. That's what I'm going to talk about. And of course, it's a real treat, I think, to actually revisit and connect with a place that you know your ancestors or your kinsmen at least were present. I know I have discovered talking to people, but not everybody feels like this. But for me, places are very important. I regularly revisit places from my past. I really enjoy doing so. And I also enjoy, as I walk around London, I'm lucky enough to walk around the city that has family connections for the last 300 years or so, and to not only to walk around, but often to eat in or read in buildings that my forebears ate or read in or studied in as well. So I do really, and I think Scotland, because it's generally quite an atmospheric country, is a particularly good place for this kind of journey. So let me introduce you to where we're going to go. This is where we see if my arrows work. Not yet, one moment. There we are. This will work, yes. So we are, of course, very much in the south of Scotland, in the Lowlands, and we're going to make a little journey around four areas. We're going to start in the west, in Ayrshire, in the Irvine Valley, the River Irvine that flows out into the Irish Sea. With really ancient Nisbet connections, perhaps some of the most ancient of all in Scotland. And then we're going to go in about an hour and a half's drive, much quicker in PowerPoint, from Irvine Valley to Edinburgh, to visit probably the place of the largest number of connections, and then to East Lothian, the site of some very wealthy Nisbets, then down to where my forebears came from the Meuse, this flat little plain down in Berkshire. We're going to skip over Glasgow, which does have really interesting connections, but perhaps particularly owing to its kind of industrial history and rapid growth, very few material remains survive, unfortunately. So the Irvine Valley, and if we look at our map at the top left, we can see Kilmarnock, which is a sort of large town of the valley, the River Irvine flowing to the east. And we're on the way, we have Galston that we will be visiting, Loudon Castle, Big Campbell Castle, Newmilns we'll be visiting, in between Greenholme, not marked on this map. And because of the valley, this was a really important weaving and then paper-making area, also coal mines as well, because the river provided the power for the mills. And as those mills shut in the 20th century, this became actually one of the most deprived areas in Scotland. I was just looking at the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is uh, both fascinating and extremely depressing map that you can visit on the government website. And there are parts of Galston and New Mills that rank amongst around about the 100th in terms of no, deprived places in Scotland. So it is a really wonderful place to visit. You do, particularly in Kilmarnock, I think you see the impact of that on the streets in the forms of empty shops. But there are revival efforts, and one of those has led to the Park Hotel, which is a private enterprise of the owner of the adjoining football club, which I think several of us have stayed there on several occasions, including our big trip to Kilmarnock and Ayrshire back in 2007, I think. And it's a training hotel. It trains local people for jobs in the hotel industry, and it's very comfortable, unexpectedly a nice place. Now you can see in Jean's fantastic map of Wikitree, thank you very much, Jean, for this, just how many places in the Irvine Valley have Nisbet connections. And I know that Patrick Nisbet has visited quite a few of these, or at least driven past quite a few, visited quite a few, and has written these up in one of the 2023 newsletters. But you can just see how deeply embedded Nisbets, no doubt mostly related to each other, are in the landscape. And also see the inhabitants of Glen John Nisbet, executed in April 1683 in Kilmarnock. And there is the spot in Kilmarnock where he was executed, being visited by Peter and by Dave Nisbet Harvey. Then you'll also see from Hardhill here John Nesbitt executed in Edinburgh, 1685. We will visit his memorial a little bit later in this tour. So this is the area where the Nisbets of Hardhill, Murdoch Nisbet, Greenholm Nisbets, ultimately the Carfin Nisbets, all come from this area. Very important half of Nisbetness, not, I think, related directly, not by blood, to Nisbet of that ilk. But I'm staying quite light touched on the genealogy and dates on this. Anyone's got any questions about that? There are much more expert people than me in the audience. So I want to talk a little bit more in this talk about the atmosphere and what it's like to go to these places. So Kilmarnock's not somewhere you're going to linger very long, I think. Good place to spend the night, but it does have this very fine gravestone renewed in 1825 to John Nisbet, taken by Major Balfour's party, suppered at Kilmarnock, 14th of April, 1683, adhering to the word of God and our covenant. And it's worth saying that the south of Scotland is covered in monuments to the Covenanters who were killed in the 17th century. And that is still very present in Scotland and very important to a lot of people. And there are associations and so on that look after these monuments and even put up new monuments from time to time. And at various points in my past, I've had the chance to walk through the hills of southern Scotland. It's not uncommon in a very lonely glen to come across the Covenanters Memorial, because this is where the people would gather for services far away from public intervention. They're quite moving places. So going along the valley that we saw in the map, Galston Kirk, which is an ancient church, goes back to the 13th century, but a very handsomely rebuilt in classical style. You can see it was a 2006 gathering in the church. You may recognize one or two faces. I see Sue Nisbet, for example, on the tartan skirt. And the most prominent memorial in the church of some Nisbet interest is to Archibald Nisbet here of Greenholm, from whom I think Patrick's line descends. Descended of Nisbet of that ilk, DNA says that's not in fact the case. Eminent in King David I's reign, Anno Domini 1126, eldest son of Robert and Barbara Nisbet, who left 6 sons and 4 daughters. And there would no doubt have been a coat of arms at one point on his shield at the bottom, would be motto, Vis Fortibus Arma, but this has long gone. Now, unfortunately, some of you will know that the Church of Scotland is going through a rough time, I would have to say, partly self-inflicted at the moment. And huge numbers of Church of Scotland churches are shutting. Galston is not one of them. It has survived. It's been formed into United Parish with two other churches in the valley. But unfortunately, Loudon Newkirk in Newmilns has been closed, has almost no, not even a memorial on the internet anywhere. It's just been like wiped out of history. It's a handsome building. I don't know what will happen to it. But in practice, if you're visiting this, it's quite a nice small town, you'll find that most of the memorials are outside the church, and hopefully they will stay there into the future. And so here is a memorial to the Edinburgh John Nesbitt, who died in Edinburgh and executed in 1685, animated by a spirit to which a genuine religion alone could give birth, the pure flame of civil and religious liberty alone could keep alive. There's an obelisk in the churchyard with blotted out for me, but depending on what you're seeing on your screen, you might see Mary Clow next to it, a really eminent expert on English language translations of the Bible, who was one of our great guides on this tour. Along with Ray Nisbet Rawlinson, some of you remember, who didn't come on the tour, but did in fact plan it, but some reason didn't actually come on it. And then also in the church, which I was asked to unveil, we went to the Sunday service. Is a plaque to Murdoch Nesbitt, who translated the New Testament into Scots. And I don't know what the future of that plaque is in the context of the future of the church. So Loudon Newkirk, as the name suggests, replaces very nearby Loudon Old Kirk. And this is a very common feature in Scotland. Is in England, usually if you rebuild a church, you rebuild it on the same site. Well, perhaps in Scotland there's more space. So, and I think also settlements tend to move. And so the old church has survived, at least in part. It's in a very attractive situation close to the river. And this is documented much more fully by Patrick in his article. Patrick managed to get hold of a map showing the Nisbet graves in the churchyard. Back in 2006, we just had a good look around, and we found Nisbet, whose first name I cannot read, wife of William Wardrop. We found Agnes Nisbet on the left, and Jane Nesbitt here on the right. I think Patrick has found a few more. So this is a really charming and beautiful spot. So somewhere that I had not been to, and I thank Peter and Patrick for their photographs and for their information, is Sun Hill, which is a very nice small laird's house, or even almost a tower house, built somewhere around about 1660, in ruins. The reason I had not visited it, we drove past the bottom of the road in 2006, but it was in a very poor state at that time. And it has been, I think, quite well restored, both inside and outside. And you can see sort of typical stepped gables of the 17th century house. You can get a sense from the size of the windows, things are coming a little bit more peaceful by this time. And then you can see some of the mementos, these carved stones that are so common in Scottish houses. So over the fireplace here, Robert Nisbet and Barbara Nisbet, 1683. Over the window here in the centre, 1660, and that has, I think, perhaps underneath it, initials of James Nisbet and Mary Kennedy of Greenholme. And then in the kitchen, there are also the initials of Archibald Nisbet of Thornhill. And you see Dave here going up and down the lovely turret stairs. So you can stay at Thornhill. There is a rented property in the grounds, but unfortunately, it's not the 17th century house. It's a modern construction. I would have to say without the kind of character that you find in the historic property. So I mean, it'd be interesting perhaps in the chat after to hear from either Patrick or Peter, but because I've actually been inside. But my impression is that this is a house rescued and rescued, pretty well. And in the map, we have just the location, so it's about 3 miles south of Galston. And there are other properties, many of which have been demolished. But I know Patrick also had a look at. And here's the picture from 2006 showing what might be the site of Hard Hill. I do think in the urban valley, there's probably more that could be done with historic maps and so on to pin down the locations of some of these farmsteads that have perhaps disappeared or moved over time. But you can see it's an attractive rolling countryside, and this part of Ayrshire, if combined with a visit to Dumfries House, the King's country house that was again rescued from a pretty bad fate around about 15 years ago, which is also training young people, I think would make a very attractive holiday. So we're going to leave the urban valley to Edinburgh, and a lot of my pictures come from two recent gatherings in Edinburgh. So some of you will remember back in 2009 we had the gathering of the clans. Which various people have tried to repeat, but no. It didn't wash its face financially, but I am very pleased that it did happen because it was a very special event with tents for the clans. You see David and Sue Nesbitt and their family there, my Italian cousins here, and then the group that kind of came and we did a Edinburgh walk. Uh, One day. We were also joined by Alan Moore Nesbitt in the centre, and Alan and Patricia very kindly hosted us for Keldy at the Drum, which I don't have any pictures of, so I can't show it to you, but it's a very charming little country house just on the edge of Edinburgh, where the family still lives and farms today. And then in 2022, a very memorable visit because as our gathering started was also the day that the Queen died. We gathered at the New Club for our dinner, and we thanked Graham Nesbitt, our newsletter editor, for many years of service there. So I had a happy day rooting through my old photographs from these trips. So Edinburgh, there was really a lot to see. So starting, we're going to look at three churches in all, Greyfriars Kirk, and I realised as I looked through my pictures, but I was quite pleased with this one. This is taken from the terrace of the National Museum of Scotland. We will look at something there a little bit later on. And it's a sort of classic Edinburgh view of the castle. The hideous 1960s buildings are mostly fairly discreet and are gradually being knocked down. And then I realised that actually by accident I'd taken a picture of Greyfriars Kirk and Greyfriars Kirkyard. And this is absolutely one of my favourite places in Edinburgh. The church is actually two churches built slightly different times, the 17th century. And you can actually see, I think, a line in the roof there, which is where the two churches met. They were united in the 1930s. It's a excellent Church of Scotland church. It's active in the community. It hosts concerts. It's open every day. It understands about how to create a place in society. And then the churchyard has a wonderful array of 17th and 18th century tombs and is very atmospheric. I will say, unfortunately, but somewhere, I don't know where because I've never read them, but the Kirkyard does feature in the Harry Potter either books or movies or both, and it's now infested with Harry Potter tours. I hope one day Harry Potter will be forgotten and the tours will disappear. But I have found in various corners of Edinburgh that I used to enjoy quite solitary contemplation. I'm never alone anymore. But it's generally, of course, a good thing, and it's a good thing for the church to have more visitors. So the kirkyard is very special to me because it is the ancient burial place for the various Edinburgh Nisbets, but particularly Nisbets of Ilk in my case. We know that the tomb was there, but we do not know where it was. And both my great grandpapa and I have hunted around a bit, and there's no plan that shows where it was. In the case of the Ilk one, the use would have stopped in the early 18th century and no doubt have been repurposed for other things. But nonetheless, we do have a nice connection inside the church, so I will show that to you in a moment. And then the second church that's well worth a visit is St. Giles. The Church of Scotland doesn't really have cathedrals, but it is essentially the cathedral. Incredibly historical and beautiful church. And you will find this rather old photo of mine before smartphones had really sought out the photography thing. The tomb of the Duke of Marquess of Montrose, one of the greatest generals ever, unfortunately fighting for the doomed cause of Charles I. But a key figure in Scottish history, a very romantic figure who won 6 battles in quick succession against overwhelming odds before being defeated at Philip Hull, which I will tell you a little bit more. I'll show you a picture in a moment. And he was, of course, executed. And then later on, this very fine tomb was erected to his memory. And there is a little card, in fact, on the tomb with the permission of the Kirk, which draws one's attention to the Duke of Montrose Society, which I'm now a member, and with whom I visited the battlefield site. And then the window behind, and this is what you want to look for when you go to the church, has the coats of arms of the various families associated with Montrose. And you can see here it's quite difficult to photograph because it's at the very top of the window, but there indeed is Sir Philip Nesbitt, to be familiar, our boar's heads there. So I think that is quite a special connection to a brave man, one of the three sons of Sir Alexander Nesbitt, who died fighting on the Royalist side in the Civil Wars. And then going back to Greyfriars Kirk, you'll find a bronze plaque inside. It's very hard to photograph because it's a little bit shiny. It's big on the wall, and this is the model for it from which the metal worker worked, painted by Harold Painter, my great grandfather, who commissioned the monument to Alexander Nisbet. Who died 300 years ago, who wrote the System of Heraldry and a whole series of other heraldic books that are still fundamental, both Scottish genealogy and Scottish heraldry. Jean, of course, has uncovered that the baptism date is incorrect on the plaque, but I don't think anyone will be correcting it anytime soon. The plaque was unveiled by John Buchan, the very well-known writer and probably a friend of my great-grandfather's, who and Robert Chancellor Nesbitt hosted a very nice lunch to unveil the plaque. The Greyfriars Kirk, well worth a visit, as is St. Charles. And a short detour down to the borders, because if I'm talking about quite closely related places for Nisbets, just to remind you, there's lots to see and do in Scotland. This is the battlefield site. As you can see on the map, it is very flat. It's next to a river, so it's in a river valley. But there's excellent interpretations, explains how the various forces encountered each other, where the battle took place. Then you see in the hills behind, This is where Montrose and his troops fled when it became clear that they were going to be defeated. It was a very foggy day. They all got hopelessly lost. Montrose did escape, I think, but Sir Philip Nisbet was captured and executed in Glasgow in 1645. Yes, Montrose did escape because he made his way to Traquair House, which I also visited a couple of years ago, claims to be the oldest inhabited house in Scotland. Is probably true if you say specify by the same family, the Stuart family. It is a really wonderful place. Just the library you see here gives you a sense of access to knowledge that reasonably well-to-do 17th century family would have had, even like in the depths of southern Scotland. It's a very, very charming place. So that sort of charm that the house that still lived in has. You can stay there. There's bed and breakfast actually in the house, full Scottish breakfast. Which looked very tempting. And the Stuarts sent Montrose away and welcomed the uh, opposing forces when they arrived. But I got a very warm welcome there. And I stayed in Melrose nearby, which has absolutely fantastic sort of red sandstone abbey Roman fort. Very beautiful orchard community garden, the whole park, just in the centre of town. Excellent bookshop as well. Always lots to do in the Scottish towns. Returning to Edinburgh, if any of you have ever walked down the Royal Mile, going to Holyrood House, for example, or see the Scottish Parliament, that amazing modern building, you would have passed the house built for Sir John Nisbet of Delton, the eminent and much reviled and criticised, seen as being rather harsh judge who did very well in life and was able to buy Dalton Castle. We'll come to that. And to either build or adapt his house for himself. Built somewhere around about 1620, one of the oldest surviving domestic houses within the walls of Edinburgh. And so, therefore, when redevelopment was taking place, this has generally been quite tactful in Edinburgh. But you can see, if you compare the historic photo and a modern photo, but there was quite an attractive tenement building just to the left, replaced by a highly unattractive tenement building today. They didn't always get it right, but an effort was made to preserve Nisbet of Delson's house and restoration efforts in, I think, the early 1950s, as the scaffolding went up, and the builders started to sort of knock out various bits of jerry-built wall and so on, because the house was actually divided to three quite handsome apartments, 17th century paneling, that had been subdivided. It actually caused the collapse of the building. So what you see has been rebuilt. It's been rebuilt well. If you compare the photo and the house. Now, so this is something you just see anytime that you're walking down Canongate, 84 Canongate. Its use has changed since I took this picture. In fact, I think we noticed in 2022 when we went past it, but there's now a hog roast sort of takeaway place. It's quite appropriate in view of the boar's heads on our arms. So you can actually go inside and you can buy some food there. And that is a lucky escape that could easily have been swept away in some currents. So Sir John was, I think, one of three sons of Sir Henry Nesbitt, Provost of Edinburgh, and they all did well. They all set up their own properties. So another was the Nesbitt, um, Sir William Nesbitt again, a son who built the House of Deans. This is in Dean Village on the Water of Leith, so running west out of the city centre, and it's a very attractive walk from Princes Street through bits of a new town. along the Water of Leaf to where the House of Dean stood, which is now the Dean's Cemetery. And you can see our group there with a yew tree, and you just get a sense in the background. I haven't got a better picture. There's a very attractive green cemetery, late 19th century cemetery. So the house was built for Sir William Nesbitt about 1609, sorry, 1621, left by the Nesbitts around about 100 years later, and then pulled down 100 years later in 1845. But parts of the house do survive. The sculptured stones that we've already seen are like a sort of Scottish feature. Um, Along the terraced walls. So the cemetery, like the house, overlooks the Water of Leaf. So there's a steep drop down to the river. And there is a retaining wall that holds up the cemetery, presumably held up the house before that, and then a path that runs along that. So you can look up at the retaining wall. And there are 20 sculptured stones. I have never managed to find all 20. I have got a list. I don't know if they all still survive, but you can see two of them here with the Dalton and Dean Nisbet's chevron, and then the three boar's heads are artistically interpreted by the sculptor. So these are taken from the house and built into the retaining wall during the conversion to the cemetery. It's still a working cemetery, and Alan Moore Nesbitt very kindly tipped me off. His own family are buried there, and these three very beautiful Art Nouveau, I think, some Celtic art style um, headstones are all to the Moore Nesbitt family of a drum in Edinburgh. So absolutely worth a visit. When you come to the end of the Dean Cemetery, you come to two big buildings that were orphanages and schools, which are now the two modern art galleries of the National Gallery. Excellent cafes. It makes a very pleasant walk. I told you that something had survived from inside the House of Dean as well. There are a total of 7 of these wood-painted panels that would have been set into the ceiling. These hang in the National Museum of Scotland, which is just opposite Greyfriars Kirk. So it's a very convenient, easy visit. It's an absolutely fantastic museum, really excellent displays. These are hung quite high, not terribly well lit, and they show a sort of series of biblical scenes. And this picture is better than my picture of the other three, one of which quite nicely does show actually Edinburgh Castle in the background of the picture. And the story that the museum tells and the sign for these, by the way, when you look for these in the museum, got to look up, otherwise you'll miss them. Is a reminder that even though we think of 17th century Scotland as quite a sort of dark and grim time with people being burnt, etc., etc., nonetheless, Scotland was in touch with the Renaissance, what was going on in France, for example, and producing these very vivid and colourful images and building them into houses. And then on the right is something that was found by my great grandfather in Nisbet House, and he rented it in 1936 to 38, I think. He spent quite a lot of time looking through the attics, as one does, and this records it's a sort of marriage achievement of one of the Carr family, John Carr, showing the antecedents of the husband and wife as they married. So it's not directly Nesbitt-Nisbet, it is the family that took over from us around about 1650 or so. And it was originally lent to a local museum, and then it was lent to the National Museum of Scotland, and my aunt and I very occasionally get letters saying, would we like to convert the loan into a donation? As a museum curator myself, I know these long-term loans, and loan has been going on for somewhere about 90 years, are administratively problematic. So at some point I will persuade my aunt that we should just make this an actual donation. This is somewhere that I hadn't been to until our 2022 walk. It was new to me. So this is where, if you remember, going back to Kilmarnock, we had the John Nesbitt, who was executed in Edinburgh in 1685, and this is the execution point. And something I missed at the time, I only saw it now when I went online, is that in the sort of coloured stones on the pavement, there's a shadow of a gallows to mark that. So the memorial was put up in 1937. And I think it's kind of been, you can see it's got modern signage. It's been reworked to try and make it work as a space. And the reason for that really is that for those of you who know Edinburgh, the Grass Market and the nearby Cowgate were, when I used to first go to Edinburgh in the late 70s, I mean, absolutely fascinating areas to go to if you wanted to understand what a Victorian slum was like. You know, deserted, apart from a few drinkers who might greet you from the doorways. Very, very atmospheric, very old reeky, but at the same time, terrible places to live, deserted. And there have been really big regeneration efforts. In fact, in 2022, we stopped at a community-run cafe at Excellent Tea that is run by one of these organizations that's regenerating these areas and supporting the local community. And so I think there's all of this reworking of the square has been to draw in visitors, draw in like pounds to be spent. And I mean, it's quite as successful. I don't know if the original designers of the monument really conceived that people would sit on it, but it is exactly the right height and position to sit on. So I enjoyed seeing that. And we had a little rest when we got there. No, I'm curious to know if anybody who's listening to this talk has been to either of these two places. I've been to both. St. John's Church is one of the two very tall, clearly early 19th century churches that are just below the castle at the get my geography right, at the west end of Princes Street. And they're just set off Princes Street, just at the end of the gardens. And one is Church of Scotland, and one is, is a Episcopalian. And that's St. John's Church here. And it's very closely associated with the Nesbitts of Dean. And there was a book on the history of the church. Basically, the Nesbitts of Dean like did their own thing, and the church council did not approve of this. So there are a lot of correspondence back and forth, which is great for historians. But nonetheless, the Nesbitts of Dean were buried here. This is a burial vault. It was slightly unattractive. Protective mesh, but you can see just about the chevron there. Take my word for it, there are boar's heads around there. And then the memorial here, we'll come back to Craig and Tinney, is to Henry Nesbitt here, who was buried there in anyway, you can work out the calculation yourself, was buried there. Now, also, further away out in the suburbs is Craig and Tinney House. So this is yet another descendant of the provost, Sir Henry Nisbet. This is somewhere I visited when I was working in a farm in Dumfriesshire. So in 1979, before the internet, I tracked it down and I went in and sort of knocked on the door, and there was a large room full of people tapping away on typewriters because some of the social work group from Edinburgh Council were based there. But there's now a community centre. It's a lucky survival because back in the 1930s, and the last owner sold the house, the usual fate in the suburbs would be to be pulled down. But you can see that it survived pretty well. You can see the same turret in the historic photograph and in the contemporary photograph. And actually, one of the reasons it survived is a very fortuitous bomb in the Second World War knocked down the very extravagant and elaborate Victorian part of the house, which is out of fashion and hardest to maintain, and just left the sturdy 17th century core that you see here. So that is very visitable. It is used for adult education mainly these days, and if you've got a little bit of time, well worth going and hunting down. So we're now going to move east out of Edinburgh to East Lothian. It is a very attractive, quite touristy because it's got the coast along the Firth of Forth, attractive coast, but it's also got wealthy farmland. It's this area of very large houses and farms that were modernizing, even in the 18th century. It was seen as an area for progressive agriculture. And there's a number of Nesbitt properties there, most of which I've not visited, but and belong to the kind of portfolio of the Delton, Hamilton, Ogilvy Nesbitts as they came, as a series of quite wealthy families married each other. But the best known of these sites, and the one that's most worth visiting, is Delton Castle. We have had one gathering there, I think, a fantastic tour by Andrew Spratt, who's just retired after 30 years as a custodian. You see it's a very spectacular castle, open to the public and full of quite satisfying buildings and lots of spaces to climb around. But there's actually much more to it than that. So it is also, because of the wealth of the family, absolutely fantastic set of gardens. I've just seen a tiny part of the gardens there, and you can see Mrs. Nisbet has Hamilton Ogilvy, the last really of the line to bear the name Nisbet, anyhow, who died in the 1920s, planting a tree there in the gardens, a beautiful church, excellent historical displays inside. And one of the things I realized when I took my copy of Pevsner with me, and those of you who don't know Pevsner, this is a series of books, always of this design. Pevsner's Buildings of England, it started with now Buildings of Scotland. These are the chunky, not exactly pocket-sized books, but describe all of the historic and interesting buildings of England, Scotland, and Wales. Well, I hadn't realised until I looked at my copy, it's a planned village. It's a very attractive village because various Nesbit's, the woman of the household, gave it quite a lot of attention over time in terms of little buildings and walls and arrangements of greens and gardens. Very attractive space. Somewhere it's proud of its history and has two excellent pubs. When we went for the society, we had lunch in one and I had lunch in the other on this time. And nearby is the much more comfortable house, but Sir John Dalton, the lawyer who bought Dalton Castle, left his property to his, I think, nephew or cousin, Sir William, who built Archerfield House, which is one of the complicated country house stories of Scotland. When I visited back in 1979, the interior had been gutted. It was in use as a grain store. It was a really terrible site. It was owned by the Duke of Hamilton, who eventually sold it to developers who did a deal with the devil. Essentially, there were two options that were financially viable, and one was to restore the house, and that's what's been done, into a hotel and a spa. You see it's a very long distance photo, my slightly fuzzy photo. But in order to fund that, around about 300 lodges have been built in the grounds. But I will say they are more or less invisible in belts of trees, that are quite hard to see. The alternative would have been to keep the grounds and restore those and leave the house a ruin. And the reason why it was a difficult decision is that the interior of the house had been completely knocked out. Luckily, excellent photographs and country life had survived, and that sort of guided the restoration. But it is, in essence, a complete rebuilding of the interior rather than the restoration of the interior. And it was highly controversial at the time. So I hadn't been to Archfield since it was a grain store. So with my friend and her son, we went along after Dalton Castle. It's about a mile or so. There's a very nice nursery and cafe. It's all part of your estate, with a map showing very attractive woodland walks. So there is quite of some public benefit to come. You can walk down to the beach, where are little arty touches like this picture frame to frame your view of Archfield. So I did look up, you can't stay in the house unless you book the whole thing for a wedding. It's 14 bedrooms. But as an indicator, one of the little timber lodges in the grounds, those are £725 a night. But you can go and have lunch and you can have high tea, but not in the house, but outside the house. But you can walk through in the grounds and have a very nice like pie and chips or salad in the garden centre, and that's what I
Pretty cool.
recommend. So
Geez,
nearby,
that's really
so we're
cool.
going south of East Lothian into Berwickshire now, the historic county of Berwickshire in the borders. We come to Paxton House, not lived in by Nisbets in this case, but built by Nisbets and almost adjacent to Nisbet property. On the River Tweed, literally on the River Tweed, the grounds drop down to the river. You see the Union Bridge there, a very early suspension bridge that connects England and Scotland. The valley of the Tweed is something I'd like to explore more. I don't know it well, but it is a famous, beautiful and fishing valley. And the Nisbet connection is that the house was designed by John Adam for the Hume family, but the master mason, who would also have had quite a significant hand in the design, was James Nesbitt, a well-known local architect who built quite a few buildings around the borders. And a Hume, I can't remember which one, but MP, I think, gave the house to a trust. It's open to the public. It has absolutely fantastic collection of Chippendale furniture built for the house. Very attractive grounds, a nice cafe. Makes a really attractive morning or afternoon out with Nisbet connections. And I think one more last stop before we get to Nisbet House is, of course, Guns Green, another rescue. So the house was built for John Nisbet and his brother. They were tea smugglers on a huge scale, and you can find a talk on our website by Derek Jane, his PhD thesis about this. I now have my own PhD student working in the history of tea, and I've been learning a bit more about this and designed by John Adam, which is very lucky. It's an Adam house, much easier to get money to restore it. And it sits above the harbour at Eyemouth, so on the coast of Berkshire, the whole fishing town. And it was run as a bed and breakfast for many years. As a clubhouse for the golf course just behind it. You can go and have fish and chips in the new clubhouse. It's very good. And then was rescued by local residents and is owned by a community trust who put a flat in the top that you can rent, very attractive. Rooms to visit, but where we had tea on our last visit, and then a museum and a sort of warehouse is underneath. But of course, a key feature of the private apartments is this tea chute built into the wall that you could fill on the floor above with smuggled tea. And then if you can work out how to open the paneling, it's quite tricky. You can then take tea out from the bottom of this lead-lined chute. This little table was given by Ray Nesbitt Rollinson for the Society to support the restoration of the house. Now, the house is going through difficult times. It got flooded during a freak weather event. It's never really reopened. It was a little bit sad when we visited in 2022. And there are now plans afoot to reinvent the storytelling element of the house and to bring it really back into public life again. But no, Eyemouth, like many small Scottish towns, is struggling, particularly since EU aid disappeared. And so this kind of enterprise is really important. I'm sure, can't remember, I think we have given some money to support it. I think I see Peter nodding. As much giving our name as giving a little bit of money to support this new enterprise. So coming to finally event in Nisbet House, and back when I went to visit David and Sue Nisbet, it might have been 2009 or thereabouts, I drove over the Lammermuir Hills, which are the kind of low hills between Edinburgh and the Meuse, famous for Lucia di Lammermoor, the opera and the Walter Scott novel. And despite, I managed to find one picture without any windmills in it. Yeah, but despite the appearance of these modern electricity generating things, it's still very atmospheric. I have to say, a very quiet road. I wouldn't try it if there was any snow around, but a perfectly good drive. Otherwise, and really kind of takes you back into the spirit of the border rivers and so on. There is a more direct route, but this is the route that I would recommend. And this is the distant view of Nesbitt House. And this is, unless you've been on one of our organized visits, this is what you would have seen, because you can stop on the road that runs past the house near the dovecot. And if you look back, you do get an excellent view of the house and some new plantings in the front of it. But there are other kinds of views. This picture here was taken from a microlight, one of these little things that buzzes around in the sky, about 20 years ago. And I've dropped a line to the chap and asked for a copy. And this shows you, I think this would be probably after Magnus and Susan Laird had taken ownership and started the restorations. It looks fairly organized because you see particularly some work going on in the grounds. There's a little spring here to make lakes. Some work on some garden beds here, but you can see the layout here. There's the road that comes off that road there. There are the entry gates that those of us came in 2022. Very impressed that our coach driver managed to get through these, and you come through, as you see in the picture here on the right, to the 18th century tower first, and there's a little bit of car parking there, or you can skirt around and come to the court of offices, as they are called, essentially the stables and so on. A great walled garden here, mostly empty, another cottage. Then here, this difficulty that Nesbitt House has had for many years, where a plot of land was sold off by a previous owner, and someone has been trying to build there, but without planning permission. And the house has recently, Nesbitt House recently been sold, and I'm imagining the new owners have probably bought out that enterprise, which was always a problem for Magnus Laird. But there's this threat, but there's this building project might revive. Very cheekily built. It's going to be a two-story house with a living room overlooking the walled gardens, taking advantage of Magnus's property. So you can see the hulled, the whitewashed original building there, and then the 18th century extension. And then you can see these belts of trees, and these come from a big 18th century planting scheme that would have run much more extensively. And there's a second ring of these trees as well. It's very common sort of capability brown style work to kind of create your own forested enclave. And then there was, of course, if you look at the old paintings in this house, a big lake here where Howie Burn, which flows through the property, had been dammed, and there was a boathouse here at one point. So one or two pictures from our 2022 visit. Me with the coats of arms of the Nisbets, the old boar's heads up here, and the car arms below. Both reset, they had been taken down and were reset in the 20th century back into the walls. One of the corners of the 17th century house, showing the little splayed gun ports here. The burial mound probably built for John Carr, the first Carr to live here. And then I can't remember if I put this in the newsletter or not, but a drawing I got a few years ago by Marek Spark, a Polish Jewish artist from Paris, of a tree. And Nisbet House has always been famous for the trees and the gardens. You know, he was stationed in the Polish army in Nisbet House in the Second World War. You probably know that the Polish army, the quite large part that fled to Britain, escaped to Britain, was charged with defending Scotland, thereby allowing the British Army to go and fight elsewhere. And Nisbet House is one of the key training centres. And there must be archives relating to this that I've not yet managed to find. Um, I think it's a really interesting story to tell there. And then going back into the deeper past, so my family collection doesn't just stop in the 1650 of Nesbitt House. My great grandfather rented the property in the 1930s. You can see Lord Sinclair, a car, here, letting it out with 14 bedrooms. Would be just about enough, but I won't say that it was one bathroom for every bedroom. You can see the burial plot here, ploughing going on, the ladies' garden here, that's gone now. My great grandfather going walking the hills of Scotland, and another view of the garden and the borders here. My father in this house in 1993. So the survivor of the house, so probably built around about 1610 by Sir Alexander Nisbet, but using Catherine Swinton's money, so her initials are on the coat of arms as well. Uh, Occupied by the Carr family, but increasing episodically, as you see, let out as a holiday let. Occupied by the Poles in the Second World War, sold in 1946 to Lord Brocket, who did up the interior for a son or daughter who was getting married, but the marriage didn't work out. They never moved in. Sold again to the MacDonald family, who wanted the land rather than the house, but they got funding from the government to keep the roof intact, which is always the big thing. And I did visit the house in 1979, as did Stuart from the United States and California. And my camera, I didn't realize, had broken irrevocably. I have no pictures of that visit, but Stuart has an incredible collection of pictures. I don't know where they are now, showing the interior before the restoration. And then the American doctor who next owned the house had it hulled and whitewashed, also good for protection. And then Magnus and Susan Lair fully restored the house, the architect William Grime, around about 20 years ago. And a very successful combination of historic and contemporary style. But if you looked, or indeed still look at the, I think, Savills website, well, no, Knight Frank website, the house has just been sold. You can see the interiors are very beautiful, both in the original part of the house, the white painted part, plus the 18th century extension that the Carr family added, which gives you a kitchen on the ground floor and three very attractive rooms, one stacked on top of each other. And there we are in 2022 during our visit to the house. And I will drop a line to Magnus and see if we get any information on who owns it now. So to end, I just wanted to say again, thank you to Jean, Patrick, and Peter, much of whose know-how and some of their pictures have ended up in this talk, and to highlight two really important sources if you're ever interested in a building or a place in Scotland. And one is the National Library of Scotland has done a fantastic job of digitizing pretty much every map ever made of Scotland. And they are, you can look at them alongside a modern map or on top of a modern map. So they're really easy to work with. And then a website called Trove, a new website that brings together a lot of these sources around historic sites and historic photographs of sites. And if you take Trove and National Library of Scotland, those are a really great starting point for looking at any of these buildings. But I think I'm going to wrap up there and see if anyone has any comments or questions.
Well, Mark, let me just start by thanking you for an absolutely excellent talk. I can't think of anybody else who could speak so eloquently about all the range of properties around in Scotland that are part of our Nesbitt-Nisbet ancestry. It obviously reflects your extensive knowledge of through your family connections and all the hard work you've done over many, many years as leading our society. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Um,
So I would say if you have enjoyed this, do go back to our journal, our magazine. It's online both on our site and on the American site. And, all of these meetings had quite long trip reports afterwards, which I read some of it. I've written some myself and read others for this talk. And they are like a kind of permanent archive of including quite a lot of detail on what route did people follow and so on. It's quite helpful for planning.